There is a fellow who's been a long time participant in this year, and he only, I think, actually came physically once, maybe twice, but I think only once he came to the other building, but he does listen all the time, and he often participates at night on the Zoom share. And he's dedicating it's Gabor, and he's dedicating the shir in memory of his mother, whose yahrzeit is Erev Yom Kippur, and because there's no shir next week is why we're doing it today. So the shir should be Ilui Nishmat Miriam Bat Avraham Aleh Shalom, and I think we could begin. So here we are, last parsha of the year. Very often Nitzavim and Vayelach go together, so this year they're separate. And let's just keep in mind that we are towards the end of Devarim, because there's something important about that. I'm going to try to double back to this. So we're going to begin like I think we almost always do, and that is in Perek Lamed. And it's what's called by some the Parshat Tshuva. When all this comes about, and then it uses the word Bahashevota, and the word or the root of shav is used multiple times. You have nothing to do, you can count them up. Vashevota el levavcha b'chol hagayim. V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. V'shav Hashem Elokecha et shvutcha. V'shav, and so on. And again, it continues. Vatata shuv, ki yashuv, ki tashuv, and so on and so forth. So over here, this idea of return, and it's perfect because we are like right before Rosh Hashanah, right before Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. So perhaps the proper way of doing this would be actually to delineate and read carefully and figure out what each and every one of these elements are. But first I want to do things which are a little bit broader. The Rambam brings this section, source number 2, Hilchot Tshuva, Perek Zayin, Halacha Hey. Kol HaNeviim kulam tzivu ala tshuva. So it's interesting because he speaks about an obligation, but an obligation of tshuva in terms of the prophets, not in terms of the Torah. That itself is interesting. Kol HaNeviim kulam tzivu ala tshuva, ve'ein yisrael negalin ela b'tshuva. And tshuva is one of the essential elements of redemption taking place. Ukvar hivticha Torah, and the Torah has already assured. So that's getting to our section, which he's calling an assurance. Shesof Yisrael lasot tshuva, b'sof galutan. At the end of the exile, the Jews will do tshuva. So first of all, it's interesting because what the Rambam is doing, and again, he's not necessarily working over here as a parshan, although one should really pay attention when the Rambam uses psukim throughout the Mishnah Torah, because he is actually very precise when he uses his verses and which verse he uses to illustrate something. So over here, he calls this a haftacha, and he talks about this as being something about the end of days. We've noted in the past that the Rambam also says ve'ein yisrael negalen ela b'tzedakah, which is nice, but not for today. B'sof galutan, which is the Rambam's reading, but again at the beginning of the section, Vayelki yavo alech kol d'me'ela bracha kala, and so on, and you're going to be spread out among all the nations. At the end, there's going to be an ingathering of exiles. Umiyad heim negalin shenemar ki yavo alech kol dvarim. V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, v'shav Hashem Elokecha, and so on. So the Rambam utilizes this section in order to tell us about an event that will take place in the future, but very notably, he doesn't use this section to say that there is a specific mitzvah on the individual Jew to, quote unquote, do tshuva, whatever that means, to do tshuva, to repent, to fix their ways, and so on. Or let's even say with the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur coming up, the Rambam sees this as a historical event and not as an event which is connected to the calendar or specifically having to do with this time of year. So, as I said, quoting our verses and so on. On the other hand, this is the 7th chapter of Hilchot Teshuvah. And we're going to look in a moment to the first chapter. I don't know to what extent we realize how remarkable Hilchot Tshuva is. So just to begin to think about this, first of all, the Rambam, for the most part, in his various laws, sections, books of the Mishnah Torah, again, you have 14 books, and I just want you to give it a moment of thought that if you're the Rambam and you wake up one day and you say, I want to write the Rambam, what would be the most logical way of creating order? And the answer is to have followed the Mishnah. That would have been the logical thing to do. Why create your own system? And I can say the same thing to the Torah, who creates the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. Why recreate something with something else? Now, the Shulchan Aruch, on the other hand, he leaves out all kinds of things which are not practical in his day. The Rambam includes all of Judaism, so instead of taking all of Judaism and putting it into 14 books, which he constructs, and by the way, 14 books and precisely 1,000 chapters, to show you how the Rambam thought this out with precision. So he decides that he's going to create something. Now, one of the things that does not exist in the Mishnah is a book on tshuva. There is no Mishnah of Masechet Tshuva, which means the Rambam made something up over here. That's interesting. By the way, for that, you can go and look at all of Sefer Mada. It becomes very interesting. Sefer Mada, again, I hope some of these things we have familiarity with, but if I would have started with Sefer Ahava, started with Kriyat Shema, oh, look at that. That's pretty similar to the beginning of the Mishnah when you go back in the beginning of Brachot and you start going through the Mishnayot. So therefore, the Rambam put a whole book of introduction, and that this book of intellectual processes, Sefer Mada, which talks about rejection of idolatry, right? That's the second thing. And even before that, we have certain things the TORAH, things that you need to know about. So the Rambam creates introductions, but he puts in that book the book of Tshuva. I am unaware of any book that he used as an inspiration to write his book. It seems very much like he woke up one morning and said, I'm going to include this. And now you have to think about, okay, how do I structure it? Not just how do I structure this whole book and where do I put it within my 14 books? Because there are other places you could have put it. But it's more than that. What's chapter 1 going to be, and what's chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and 5? And yes, there's the famous statement or footnote that Rav Soloveitchik makes where he mentions how Reb Chaim imagined that the 10 chapters are to be studied on the Aseret Yimei Tshuva, and that's a wonderful fantasy. And I think people do it because of this footnote that he has in passing. But the Briskers do like the Rambam. And I'm just going to give you an indication now why. Because the Rambam was a Brisker. Now we can debate that point. That's highly debatable. But we could debate that. But nonetheless, I want you to see what he did in the first chapter. And I'm just going to now say another thing. He could have skipped the first chapter of Hilchot Tshuva, and none of you would have said, oh, that's strange, something's missing. Not only that, he could have skipped the second chapter, the first halacha. He could have started with the second halacha, and none of you would have sensed, oh, there's something missing over here. So now we're not learning the whole Rambam and Hilchot Tshuva, so you may not know what I'm talking about. And then he has whole chapters that don't talk about Tshuva, that rather he deals with Bechira Chavshit, and the 10th chapter doesn't talk about Tshuva at all. It talks about the love of God. So now let's look at source number 3, the Rambam, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph. Kol mitzvot shebetorah, bein aseh, bein lo taseh, im avar adam al achat mehem, bein bezadon, bein b'shgaga, any mitzvah, positive, negative, a person broke it on purpose, by accident. Kish hayaseh tshuva, which is a very strange turn phrase, that when he does tshuva, when he returns, when he wants to fix this, when he wants to change, v'yashuv micheto, and he used now the word tshuva and v'yashuv, one after the other, v'yashuv micheto, and returns from his sin, chayav, he's obligated, lehitvadot, to say vidui, to verbally express, lifnei hakel baruch hu, in front of God. Tshuva is always in relationship to God. Tshuva is not something which a person says to themselves. It's not something that you say in the mirror. It's not something that you say to your therapist. Tshuva is something which is in front of God. It's part of the God relationship. Shenemar, and now he quotes a verse. So of course the exciting thing will be, where's the verse coming from? Meaning he's building a case. He's telling you where this comes from. The other thing which is really interesting, but you don't realize it yet, is he said that you need to do vidui. You need to say it. You need to express it. And that itself is interesting. I mean, I could say there's a difference between a fleeting thought and articulating something. I can also say that perhaps actions are needed. Perhaps it's a question of action more than of words. Because as much as I can say that fleeting thoughts are one thing, I can also say that words are something, but actions perhaps are stronger. How that manifests itself in all cases is another point. Shenemar, isho isha, ki yasu v'gomer, vidvadu et chatatam asher asu. Zevidui devarim. So we're going to have to look for a second and figure out where he got that from. Moreover, to drive all the commentaries on the Rambam crazy, he writes vidui zemitzvat aseh. The positive obligation here is vidui, instead of saying that the positive obligation is tshuva. Now, there are those who are going to say that there's no distinction. The way you do tshuva is by doing vidui, and don't tell me that vidui, this technical articulation, is the mitzvah. No, vidui is how you do tshuva, and it's a question of linking up motivation together with articulation. But I can assure you that the various commentators on the Rambam, they go to town on this. And then he says, Ketzad mitvadin, how exactly do you do vidui? And this should be a little more familiar to us. Omer, he says, Ana Hashem, again, in front of God, please God, Chatati, I've sinned. That's recognition of the sin. Chatati, Aviti, Pashati, what's the difference between Chet, Avon, and Pesha? It's worthwhile to know that. Is it on purpose? Is it by accident? Is it a rebellion? Lefanecha, v'asiti kach v'kach. Here is what I've done. V'reinichamti uvashti. I regret what I've done. I'm embarrassed what I've done. By the way, that's a level. That is what we can call today charata. I reject what I've done. I'm embarrassed. It's stronger. B'masai ula'olom eini chozer l'davar zeh. And I will never return to this again. So you have recognition of the sin. You have rejection of the sin, embarrassment from the sin. And then you have accepting upon yourself in the future. So you realize that these elements together, and that is vidui. But the other point is that the vidui that we're expressing over here, that's what tshuva is. You reject the past, you stop doing what you're doing, you reject the past, and you accept for yourself for the future. Whoever does more of this, it's better. And moreover, the people who would bring all the various offerings, they would not be atoned. There's no atonement until they do tshuva. So then, again, if you're wondering this interaction between vidui and tshuva, and they would need to, again, to articulate it, and they need to do vidui, and so on. And all people who deserve of punishments, it doesn't work until a person does vidui vidvadu. In terms of interpersonal, even if you repaid them, there's no atonement. So what did the Rambam just now do? He did something really interesting. First of all, he aligned tshuva with vidui and wrote for us a verse. The verse comes from source number 4. We're in the middle of Sefer Bamidbar. You could have easily have guessed that he wrote something from Vayikra. Deber b'nei Israel, isho isha ki yasumi kol chatat adam, any person who has sinned. L'm'ol mal b'Hashem, which is an interesting turn of phrase as well. A sin is me'ila, because God didn't allow you to do that. You did something you're not allowed to do, so there is me'ila involved in that. V'ashma hanefesh ahi, and causes, that's a really strong term, and causes the soul, as it were, to become a place which is desolate. Vidvadu et chatatam asher asu. The person needs to say the vido. V'shivat hashemo b'rosho v'chemesh yosif alav v'natan asher asham lo, and so on and so forth. So, what was so exciting about what just now happened? If you look through the entire 5 books of Moshe, you'll have a very hard time pointing out the verse that says that you're obligated to do tshuva. By the way, tshuva may be a very good idea. Pragmatically, it could be a wonderful thing to do. But where did it ever say that you can do tshuva? I mean, more than that. Where does it ever say in the Torah that you can do tshuva, and when you do tshuva, you've erased what you've done? Where do you see that at all? So what the Rambam does, and he's going to continue to do this throughout this chapter, the chapter is his introduction to tshuva, and what he does is he walks into the world of korbanot. You also noticed he walked into the world of other kinds of punishments, into the Beit Din as well. And he sees situations where a person is going to achieve atonement, and then he borrows from those sections, and then he's going to use this as an introduction, and then he's going to have tshuva stand by itself. Now, if that wasn't clear what I just now said, I'm going to try again. What the Rambam does is he establishes that there is some kind of a thing called vidui, which works in the world of korbanot, and then essentially he raises a problem. He doesn't do it the way that Tosfos is going to say, hold it, but how can you say this because of this? He just weaves together a narrative. What's the narrative that he weaves together? And it's later on in the chapter, you don't have it in front of you. Yom Kippur, for example, works because we have a Beit HaMikdash, and we have a Kohen Gadol, and we have a Seir Mishtaleach. Now, what happens when you don't have a Kohen Gadol, and you don't have a Beit HaMikdash, you don't have a Seir Mishtaleach? The Rambam insists that tshuva works by itself. Now, that's absolutely astounding. On top of that, you can ask him, well, how do you know that? Okay, so I'm sure he would put forth an argument, but that's what he does. He argues that we can take out of the Beit HaMikdash, we can take out of the Korbanot, the basic core, and that is this human element of vidui, and the vidui can stand by itself within the world of tshuva. So therefore, essentially the Rambam builds the world of tshuva and the book of tshuva, and he builds it from this element of korbanot and the vidui. Now, it's no surprise now that he says the mitzvah is to do vidui. Why is the mitzvah to do vidui? Because that is the foundation of tshuva as far as he's concerned. By the way, now you see why the Rambam is a brisker. He's a brisker because he's looking for the dynamics, exactly how does this work, and this whole first chapter, therefore, is breathtaking, because he's showing you the dynamics. The dynamics is, what is the core of tshuva? Well, the core of tshuva is something which we find in the world of korbanot, because there you have a place of bringing about atonement, by the way, much more often for things done by accident than things done by purpose, but the Rambam then takes it out of the world of korbanot, applies it to all human actions and all human endeavor, whether to sin against God or a sin against man, and says that vidui is something which can stand by itself outside of the Beit HaMikdash. Now that itself is fascinating. Now, I just want to maybe overstate this a little bit. Vidui is essentially kudshim. What do I mean by kudshim? It's part of the world of korbanot. But we're able to use this part of korbanot and use it in our own sense. Now, by the way, what happens when we misuse it? What happens when we said a vidui and we're not sincere? We said a vidui and we come back, and we were never sincere when we said it, and we come back and we do the thing again. Notice in source number 5, this is from the Al-Chetz. One of the Al-Chetz, if that's plural, that we say is Al-Chetz shachatanu lefanecha bevidui peh. That we do vidui for the vidui that we said, which was inappropriate. And by the way, I'll go one step further. It could be that to misuse a vidui is itself me'ilah. Why is that? We had me'ilah a second ago. Why? Because I'm using kudshim, or I'm misusing kudshim. Which means I want to go back to this Rambam, that vidui is the mitzvah. Vidui is something which is somehow can leave the world of korbanot. I can go and achieve what a korban can without bringing the korban. And how do I do that? I take the core, which is the vidui, I take it out of the Beit HaMikdash, and I still utilize it, but be careful. The vidui is powerful. Be careful, the vidui is the way that we do tshuva. Not that the Rambam is hyper-focusing, as some would argue, that the mitzvah of tshuva is this action. It's much more the Rambam is bringing out the argument about where do you see that there's such a possibility of changing things, and the answer is, he went into the world of korban. And that's why I'm going to say it again. Had all of the first chapter been missing, none of you would have said, we're missing something. No, he starts the second chapter as far as what exactly is tshuva gemura, then goes on to what is tshuva. And if he would have just began, I'm going to say it again, second chapter, second halacha, what is tshuva? You would have said, oh, fine, that's the natural place to begin, Hilchot Tshuva. But no, he felt that he first needed to build this core of where it comes from. Yeah.
I always thought, and maybe it's just that the veto came from when Moshe and Hashem have to take the veil. So, because that's what it says, Vayavar Hashem, Abanav, and Vayikra, and then we say the Shoshes Remito. So,
That's fine. But the Shloshes Midot are things about God. That's not vidoy. That's saying God is forgiving and so on and so forth. That itself is not vidoy. That is saying that because God revealed, because God has all of these attributes, therefore it is possible to do things which I would have thought are impossible. Which means when the Chet Egel takes place, God says, that's it, I'm rejecting OUisrael. But then God, after Moshe prays a little bit, God reveals and says, okay, this is what you need to know, and therefore the Gemara then says, and this is what you need to say or do, and it's going to create something. Again, all of that is correct, and it would have been interesting. I mean, your argument is wonderful. You say, okay, why doesn't the Rambam just start with Yud Gimel Midot and say, hold it? From here we see that things could be changed. But I'm going to say it again. He is looking at the 5 books of Moshe and says, where do we see that an individual can go and change something, and he's really taking it out of the world of Korbanot? Which then, meaning again, you could have said maybe all of Hilchot Teshuvah should have been in the Rambam's book of Korbanot. Aside from at the very end, after all the other korbanot, oh yeah, by the way, we can accomplish all this. But no, he puts it in terms of knowledge of God. And I'm going to try to come back to that a little bit, because perhaps the key over here is that where does the sin come from? It comes from not acknowledging God. And therefore it's in the book of Mada as much as it could have been in other places. Okay, excellent. So, let's continue. We'll come back hopefully to source number 6 soon. The Gemara in source number 7 says something which I'm just going to stay on for a second and think about. There's a Gemara in Yoma, and here it waxes on poetically about tshuva. Line after line after line, and a couple of pages here. Amav Chamer Bar Chanina, Gedola tshuva. Tshuva is so great, so awesome. Shemivi refu la'olam. It brings about health to the world. Shenemar mishuvatam ohavim nidava. We've turned over the next side of the page. Pei vavam in bet. Amar Rav Yonatan gedol, not in our sources. Gedola tshuva shemivia et ha'geula. That tshuva brings redemption. So now this to me is interesting. Are we now talking about the tshuva from Devarim Perek Lamed? Or are we talking about some kind of an individual act of tshuva? And I'm going to try to explain this a little bit more. When the Rambam told us back in source number 2 that this section talks about a future action, let's remember something. The whole second part of Sefer Devarim was dealing with national institutions. It was dealing with the king and dealing with an army and dealing with shoftim and so on and so forth, dealing with war. And then it went on and it dealt with exile. That was in Kitava. So now, following that, and that, by the way, that's what the Rambam quotes. He quotes all the things that come upon you. Again, just realize he quoted both. And then there's going to be this national thing take place, which means when it says over here that tshuva brings back geula, are we talking about a national geula, and therefore really perhaps this does reflect what we have in this section? Or is it talking about individual geula? And if it's the individual geula, do I look at it as being an independent microcosm of the same dynamic? Or do I say that this is what is going to build about the national redemption, all the individuals being redeemed? Which means, if I'm not speaking English yet, which means that when I look at my own personal tshuva on Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Yemei Tshuva, Yom Kippur, should I see it as part of a national event? And again, if I'm going to the end of Devarim, then yeah, it's something which is national. So over here when the Gemara says that it brings about tshuva, and then it brings a pasuk from Yeshayahu, Uva L'Tzion Goel, U'L'Shavei Fesha B'Yakov. Remember, the Rambam says that all the Nevi'im, they talk about tshuva. So this sounds very much about a national Uva L'Tzion Goel. Mishum Deshavi Fesha B'Yakov. Amar Reish Lakish, Gedol Tshuva Shezdono Na'aset Lo Kishkagot. The greatest tshuva because it turns deliberate sins into things which are as if they were an action. Shnei Mashuvi Yisrael Hashem Lakecha Kikoshalto Bavonecha. Ha'avon mezidhu v'kalkari le'michshol. Avon means that you did something on purpose, and now it's called a michshol, which means you tripped. But didn't Reish Lakish also say that if you did tshuva, then it turns the deliberate sin into a merit, and it says, But the Gemara here tells us there's two different types of tshuva. One is motivated by love of God, one by fear of God. One turns it into an accident if it was by fear, and one turns it into a merit if it was motivated by love. There's more expressions of tshuva coming up over here. Gedol tshuva shemorechet shnotav shel adam, which again very much sounds like the individual, and so on. In source number 8, the Tolda Yitzchak, and this is Yitzchak Karo, this is just going to strengthen what we've already heard in the Rambam, but it's going to focus us in a way that maybe we didn't think clearly enough yet. So this is the future. All these things are going to happen. He says, this is about the future. Again, he's writing this hundreds of years ago. This is about the future. Because it hasn't happened yet. And then he adds in that what we were not thinking about, when we talk about a return of the exiles, that includes the 10 Shvatim that we've long ago have forgotten about, don't think about. But by the way, the topic of the return of the 10 Shvatim and those who've been looking for them at different points in history is a fascinating topic, but we'll leave that for now. And he goes on trying to show you in the verses themselves how this is referring to the 10 Shvatim as well as our return from our land. Al search Shvatim shehem mekvatzim v'chutz la'artzam ki yom hazeh shayu mekvatzim b'mir chutz la'artzam kol search Shvatim shehem niduchim be'enovotzim l'zeh amar b'zeh b'chol hagim asher diduchim. And he goes on to say that v'shav v'kibetzcha hu Yehuda u'Binyamin. So he's working all these various returns and those returns and this return, that one is talking about the return of the nations, of the tribes we know about, and one is talking about the tribes that we don't know what happened to them. Sorry, could you say that again? So that's a really interesting read of our section. Now, the Ramban is going to be complex. I know for some the Ramban is very simple, but the Ramban is going to be complex because the Ramban is going to say everything that we've heard already, and then add more. On the one hand, he's going to start and say, I already said in Vayikra, ki parsha zot atida, ki kol inyana lo hayu v'lo nivru, aval hem atidim liot. So just like we just now saw, this is the future. Now the Rambam already said this is the future. We've already seen the Tolda Yitzchak already also said to us that this is the future. The Ramban also says the future. Incidentally, the Ramban is of the opinion that the Vayikra Tochacha is talking about the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and the Devarim Tochacha is talking about the second Beit HaMikdash. But as I said, I don't need to do that specifically, but therefore, according to him, at the end of the Vayikra Tochacha, we did return, but at the end of the Devarim Tochacha, we haven't returned yet, so therefore this section deals with things that just haven't happened yet. So that's a little bit more of the Ramban when he says what I already told you there, so that's what he expects that you know. I'm not going to read all of this, but what's bolded, Vayashuva Adam Bizmanahu Lashar Yakodim Chito Shel Adam Rishon. He's talking about the future. He's talking about this idea that God is going to change our hearts. Yetzer Hara is going to go away. We are going to become like Adam Harishon before the sin. Of course, you can then ask, so then what about reward and punishment if there's no free will? Well, next couple lines, Elu Yemot Mashiach, Shem Lo Schut V'Lo Chova, Ki Mei HaMashiach Lo Yiba Adam Chefetz, Aval Yasu B'Teva Amaseh Ra'oi, Lefichach Ein B'Hem Lo Schut V'Lo Chova. Right, there won't be reward or punishment in that messianic age because everything will become natural. Our inner self will change. On Pasuk Yud Aleph, so maybe just take a quick look back at what Pasuk Yud Aleph said. It said, Ki HaMitzvah Hazot. Now use the word mitzvah. That's what's important. Ki mitzvah hazot asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. This mitzvah which I am commanding you, Lo nefleta hi mimcha v'lo rechoka hi, lo b'shamayim hi, and so on. This is accessible. You can do it. So here the Ramban Pasuk Yud Aleph says, Aval ha-mitzvah hazot al ha-tshuva hanizkeret. Ki v'hashivot el levavecha v'shavtet Hashem Elokecha mitzvah shitzava otanu la'asot kein. V'nemra b'loshon ha-beinoni l'rmoz b'haftacha ki yatira davar liot kein. Now, essentially what the Ramban says is that even though this entire section is talking about the future, and even though what we're dealing with is a future prophecy where the Jews are going to return to the land and so on, and he's talking about the most dramatic changes in human history where we return back to what we were before the sin, he still nonetheless says that embedded in this section is the specific obligation to do tshuva. So if you were to ask the Rambam, where does the mitzvah of tshuva come from? He would have told you that it comes from the world of korbanot, and essentially it's built upon the concept of vidui. If you ask the Ramban, where does the mitzvah come from? It comes from this section at the end of Devarim, which says specifically this mitzvah. So therefore, apparently not just is there this mitzvah to get to this national redemption, which is based upon the people changing, but there's a mitzvah for each and every one of us to do tshuva independently. The Rambam would say that section is God promised that it's going to happen. The Ramban would agree, but essentially we have two fundamental different ways of understanding what the mitzvah is. And then again, those who will argue that according to like the Minchat Chinuch argued, according to the Rambam, there's no mitzvah of tshuva. Vidu is a mitzvah. Tshuva is not a mitzvah. I think he overplays his hand a bit, and I think that one can argue with that. The Rambam would seem to believe that tshuva is a mitzvah, but he had to show where it came from. And therefore, he wasn't comfortable with just kind of cherry-picking that one verse in the middle of this section, because he understands that this section is about a national event that will take place. Excellent. We're going to make, I won't say a dramatic turn now, but we're going to read one of the spiritual descendants of the Ramban. It's the Ran. The Ran is a student of the Ramban. And the Ramban is going to read the same things, and he has the Ramban open in front of him. To what extent he's actually exactly or precisely saying the Ramban is interesting, but he actually works out the psukim in a really interesting way, and that's going to take us in another direction. In source number 10, this is in the famous Drashot of the Ran, he writes, V'tzarech, again, he's quoting our verses, Vayoki yavo elecha kol dvarim eila, bracha v'kla, and so on, V'yeshivot elevavcha, v'shavtet Hashem lekecha, v'shav Hashem. So now we realize these are our verses. V'tzarech l'daktik b'mikrot halalu, we need to be very careful as we're reading these verses. Ki yom harishona v'shivot elevavecha, v'achar kach amar v'shavtet Hashem lekecha. So he wants to, what's all this movement? You're going to return, God will return to you, you're going to return, God's return. What is all of the movement taking place? And I told you, that's ultimately what one needs to do to understand this section well, but we're still going to do this in very broad strokes with blurry lines. Amar od v'shavi kibatzcha mikol amim v'tzorich be'ur mahim shnei zugot halalu v'nira lefarsham kach. Because I think that the proper way to understand this is as follows. Rishona amar v'ashevota el levavcha. That there will be some kind of a return in your heart. Klomar. What does that mean? Sheteharher hatshuva balev. Now he uses a turn of phrase, which perhaps is popular to us. It's not used in Chazal as much as you would think. It's never, as far as I know, used in the Mishnah or the Tosefta or the Medrash Halacha. It's used in the Gemara a couple of times, less than a handful of times, and that's called hirhur tshuva. Hirhur or thoughts, perhaps fleeting thoughts. Now I don't want to get ahead of myself and define what it means, but he says, Klomar shetaharera tshuva balev. So as much as maybe you think that you think in your head, he's saying you think in your heart, as it were. That there's something, again, it's this dynamic that we need to figure out. Shetzarhera tshuva balev, aval lo tishalmena adayin shetaseh befoal. He's saying that your actions have not changed, but there's something going on within your heart, which means your complacency in terms of the trajectory of your life suddenly gets somehow, now I don't know what word to use. Should I say jolted? Did I say it's dramatic? Should I say that it's, I don't know. Because he's saying that there's something over here. And then subsequently you'll become stronger, and then you'll be able to complete the task. And that's why subsequently it talks about actually listening to God and doing what he says. That your somehow movement in your heart is going to cause some kind of divine movement. Klomar. It's that essentially your first act of some kind of breaking your complacency will cause a divine reaction, which in turn will cause a human reaction, which in turn will cause a divine reaction. Now, all of this is fascinating, and we need to understand where all of this comes from. And he talks about this eventually getting to this place of complete tshuva, and you can read the rest of this on your own. The Sforno I could have read by himself, or I could have read it through the lens of what we just now read, or I could have read it through the Ramban, although secretly the way to read this is through the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed. That's really what he's channeling. But he talks about Veshivotu Levavecha, again, return in your heart. Hitbonein b'chelkei hasotiv v'tashivei melovcha yachdav lavchin ha'emet min hasheker. He talks about this dynamic of being able to distinguish between truth and false. Now, the reason I say to look in the Rambam and the Guide for the Perplexed is that's what he talks about in the first couple of chapters, is the distinction between truth and falsehood. But perhaps a person who lives a life, I'll say the life of a sinner. Don't jump on me on that. But they live their lives because their world is a world of lies. And at some point, maybe they break that lie and they're able to distill some kind of truth within it. And the moment that you realize that the life that you're living is this world of a lie, and there is an other truth, so that changes things dramatically. So that's what I'm saying, is that you very much could understand this from what the Ramban spoke about. Eventually you get to this world of truth, and then you can't even enter that world of a lie, or for that matter, what the Ran spoke about, where he said that it's this beginning spark. But what is the beginning spark? I'm still going to have to come back to that. The Gemara, which is the most famous expression of Hirur Tshuva, is one which actually causes the commentaries a great deal of difficulty. So the preamble to this is source number 12. The preamble is the Mishnah, the Gemara on the previous Amud, and there it spoke about different conditions that a person can set up in terms of a possible marriage. I go over to a young woman and I say, Harei mekudeshet li, b'tabat zo, and she can say, I don't like rings, right? I don't need a ring, right? My wife, if she were here, she would confirm this. I could have gotten her a piece of cheesecake. It would have, it would have worked absolutely, and certainly the whole cake. And believe me, there's some places in Yerushalayim that unfortunately it's Sheva Pruta. Right? I can tell you a place to get the best cheesecake, 45 shekels for a slice.
Where, Rabbi?
Not now, not afterwards. But I'll just say this, that the French, they have upped the game of everybody in Yerushalayim in terms of the baking. So, to continue, if I say, Aret Mukudeshet Li Almanach and Evilach Uga, if I bring the Uga, Mukudeshet. Or for that matter, those of you who like cars, I can say on condition that I buy you a 2025. If you do it, then you're married. You don't do it, meaning marriage could be conditional. So within this wonderful world of conditions, so let's say somebody comes over to this nice girl, he looks at this nice girl, and she's a nice girl, but he's not a nice guy. And he kind of wishes that this nice girl would marry him, and he goes over, and let's look at the Gemara. And first he says to her, would you like to go out with me? And she says, absolutely not. Why? Because you're a bum. I don't want to go out with a bum. I want to marry a nice guy. And then he says, right? He takes out the ring and he says, all right, Mukadesh li, read the words of the Gemara, al minat shani tzaddik, on condition that I'm a tzaddik.
On the condition that what?
On a condition that I am a tzaddik, that I'm a righteous man. The Gemara then says, and this is what drives everybody crazy, the Gemara says, afilu rasha gamor, even if he's a completely wicked person, mikudeshet, they're married. How? Shema hirher shuva bida'ato. Perhaps at that moment, he had this thought of tshuva. Now, all of you should say to me, who cares? Who cares about that? Meaning, what could that thought have done? And on the one hand, this line drives people crazy.
Well, this is the story of Rabbi Akiva.
Maybe.
I mean,
Good, excellent thought. Look, there, she says, on condition that you go and study and so forth, very good. The Gemara says, Amunat shani rasha. It's a righteous person, says on condition I'm a wicked person. I feel tzadika more mikudeshet shema he heard divar v'dazar bidato. Now, when the Rambam brings down this law, he says mikudeshet misafek. Maybe they're married. Why are they maybe married? Because maybe the person had that fleeting thought. But let's just follow this up a second. So let's say he had a fleeting thought. Which means, is that enough? What happened to, again, the other elements? What happened to rejection of the past? What happened to acceptance in the future? What happened to returning the things that he stole? What happened to vidui? What happened to all of the other elements over here? Which means, what is the value of this fleeting thought? On the other hand, I can assure you that there are those who wax poetic about this and say, look at this unbelievable thing, hear her tshuva. Now remember something. How did we get here just now? We got here because the Ran told us that our verses were talking about her tshuva. In source 13, the Rekanati also comes from this world, again, even though he's Italian, but he's very influenced by the Ramban, and he wrote a commentary on the Ramban. This is his halachic rulings. He writes, Katav Rabbi Simcha. Now, you don't know who Rabbi Simcha is yet. To find Rabbi Simcha, we're going to have to afterwards look in the Or Zarua and find out that Rabbi Simcha is the teacher of the Or Zarua, which means we're going back into the world of the Bali Atosfot. Katav Rabbi Simcha, Dekol Bali Tshuva Tzrichen Tefila, that, and this is really interesting. This may explain why certain people go to the mikveh erev Rosh Hashanah, or why people go to the mikveh erev Yom Kippur, that anyone who does tshuva needs to do tefillah. Now, I'm going to say this again, parenthetically, this is fascinating. Do you require, or is it simply a really good idea psychologically to have some kind of a rite of passage when a person changes from being a sinner to being a Baal Tshuva? So there actually was a custom of people to go to mikveh. And by the way, I can take a more extreme example that happened in the times of Baalei Tosfot. We have the Crusaders forcing people to convert, to baptize. So what happens when they want to re-enter the Jewish community? So what's the reality? The reality is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. You don't have to do anything. A convert, on the other hand, needs to go to mikveh. So they actually had a custom that a Baal Tshuva goes to mikveh. Why? I don't know if it's because the halacha requires it, or perhaps the person needed some kind of, I'll say it again, of a rite of passage to feel that they've changed. So maybe that going to the mikveh on Erev Yom Kippur is something along these lines, but let's read those words again. And he quotes a source in Avot Rabbi Natan. Miu, on the other hand, ain't a tefillah ma'akevet. He goes, let's be honest, this tefillah does not, if you didn't do the tefillah, then it's not like you're lacking anything. El miyad sheherher tshuva harehu tzadik gomor. As soon as by the way, this should be the most outstanding thing that you've heard in terms of the ability of tshuva. You just need to think about it. You're at tzadik gomor. Elishet tzarich l'tzara etzmo. It's still a person. Again, this comes from the German Baalei Tosfot, those who believed that there needs to, which is not the Rambam's world. They believed very much that all pleasure needs pain in order to take away the things that you enjoyed. So it is coming from that world. A much longer expression of what we just now read is in the Or Zur, but one of the things that I want to stress is if you go back to the Gemara, there are different authorities who have different texts of the Gemara in front of them. Some say that the Gemara said, Amanat shani tzadik gomor. You notice the line over here. On condition I'm a complete tzaddik. Even if the person was wicked and they just had these thoughts of tshuva, that's enough. And that's perhaps reflected by what we just now saw in the Rekanati. Person's wicked and they had thoughts, raise a tzadik gomor. It changed it. The Gemara said, afilu rasha gomor, right? the Gemara, or later on, the flip side, Amanat Shani Rasha Filu Tzadik Gomer. So there was a little bit of a discussion among the various manuscripts about the Gomer, but again, I don't think it changes things for us all that much. It just perhaps makes it even stronger. Over here in the Ur Zarua, he goes on to say, any sin which a person may have committed, including murder, person has thoughts of tshuva, he could be the shliach tzibur in Yom Kippur. Okay, try that out in your local shul. It's bolded in the middle of the page. Va'od nira defili rotseach shaharid b'mezid. A murderer who deliberately murders. V'asa tshuva reizan aser shliach tzibur. Shoy odif mitzadik mikaro. B'makom shabali tshuva omdim. He's better than a tzaddik. Ve'enu dom but it's not the same thing somebody did avodah zarah. There is a specific law that if somebody was a kohen who was a kohen for avodah zarah, can no longer be a Kohen in the Beit HaMikdash. And he discusses this a little bit in the middle, and he considers that to be more of a mum. But again, along the way, he quotes our text. And again, for us, this should be completely shocking. But the reason I'm bringing this is that all this is built upon this same concept of that if a person has thoughts of tshuva, that's it. Thoughts of tshuva are enough. I still need to come back to the Ran, and I need to come back to our verses. And Jerry is extremely troubled by something.
I'm troubled because I want to know where the verses we cut, where he maybe jumped at all and more. That's what's going. How did we get to the Torah? He went through the Bible, what he did. Where did he go in the Sukkot? Where exactly what lines?
The very first pasuk, pasuk Aleph, V'hashevota el levavecha. Very first pasuk, towards the end, right, end of the line. V'hashevota el levavecha. The return that he describes is in your heart, not actions. Doesn't say anything else. V'hashevota el levavecha, and then v'shavta Hashem Elokecha, and then you have v'shav Hashem Elokecha, and so on, which means that he was trying to work out this whole dynamic. It's interesting to take the Ran and now read it together with the verses, but yeah. He says that there's something in your heart. And he says it's not action-oriented yet. All that it is a thought. Now, it should come as no surprise to you that a whole bunch of commentaries are going to, I have to say this nicely, twist themselves into a pretzel to avoid everything we just now saw, because they find it way too radical. So again, just to look for an example of this, in source number 15, this is a footnote in the Bnei Yisachar, and I pronounce Bnei Yisachar because I think that's how Bnei Yisachar, right, is how he pronounced it, and not Yisachar. It's a wonderful book, by the way. It's a book which is Hasidic teachings going through the calendar. And there's a footnote here. You notice that this is Chodesh Tishrei. And it's talking about Gedola Tshuva, how great is Tshuva, which is exactly the Gemaras that we had seen there before. And in a note it says, right, and so on, Mikudeshet. Goes, how can somebody, he goes, and this will help explain how could it possibly be if somebody is a wicked person and says, that we should be married on condition that I'm a tzaddik, but he's not, how can it work? And he writes, Mikudeshet shemihira b'tshuva. Perhaps he had this fleeting thought of tshuva. Hainu, look at what's written in parentheses, b'tshuva hayidua, tshuva me'ahava v'havein. This is only to... this is only tshuva me'ahava because, again, he can't contemplate that this is possible otherwise. Now, if you said it's Hasidish because it goes and focuses on love of God and so on, it's much more than that. I think it's much more than that. It's essentially there is this whole continuum of tshuva. Let's admit something. The difficulty that we've been having the last 10 minutes or so is that this fleeting thought of tshuva, which is in my heart or in my mind, but not in the world of action, should be, all the way at the very, very beginning. It's Rav Kook would call this the nitzots, the spark of tshuva, right? You don't have a fire yet, right? You haven't not, right? Imagine that you want a cold night, you want to sit in front of a nice warm fire. The first spark, which doesn't catch necessarily yet, is hanitzot shel tshuva. But that's not tshuva. If I go back with my continuum, at the end of the continuum, would be this tshuva of an entire generation, which brings the geula. On the other hand, I can talk about more on an individual level. I can talk about this spark of tshuva. I can think about the pangs of guilt. I can think about the thoughts that a person has of lost chances, lost opportunities, lost relationships. I can think about, again, moving on from guilt and so on to perhaps fix the relationship with God, maybe moving from fear of punishment to actual getting to this point of, what am I, crazy? You know, God created this world and God has so much compassion for me, and look how much He's taking care of me, moving over towards this idea of love of God, which on our continuum is much higher. And as we saw before, Reish Lakish taught us that if you do tshuva motivated by fear of God, it turns those actions into an accident. Why did it turn it into an accident? Because, again, charata. What is charata? That you reject what you've done. What's the English word for charata? Regret. You regret. Now, when you have charata, based upon fear of God, what do you reject, or what do you regret? You regret that you're going to be punished because you're afraid. So what do you regret? You regret the punishment. Do you reject the action? Not necessarily. So what kind of action do you not get punished for? Something you did by accident. So therefore, when you did something on purpose, and you regret that you're going to be punished, and you say, you know what? I'm going to be punished. This is terrible. God, please help me. God says, fine, I'll take away the punishment. But the action is still there. And that's the dynamic of why that, according to the Reish Lakish, if you did tshuva by fear of God, it turns into an accident. But if you did tshuva based upon love of God, which then theoretically you say, well, there must be some positive energy that I can distill and turn this action into somehow servicing God. So therefore, you've retroactively have turned the negative into something which is positive. So then you've turned the negative into zchuyot. So that's a whole nother level of this. So again, I go on my continuum. I can have that fleeting thought, then I can have the rejection of the punishment. I can move over to the love of God. But that's the problem of what he did just now. The Gemara talked about this fleeting thought, Shema hirher b'tshuvah. And he says, oh, this is really, how could this possibly work? Because it's the other end of the continuum, and it's talking about the greatest level of tshuva, of love of God. Now that's wonderful, but why is he saying this? Because he can't understand how is it possible that the Gemara said what it said. So now what's the problem? Is the Gemara said what it said. That's the problem. And the Gemara is saying that this fleeting thought is enough. So it's here that I want to pause for another second. Rav Soloveitchik very much liked this idea of hero tshuva. Before I read what we have in front of us, let me just tell you a couple of things. One is that he thinks that Rosh Hashanah embodies hero tshuva. Yom Kippur is tshuva. Rosh Hashanah is hero tshuva. Where does he see this from? The Rambam. What did the Rambam say? It's not in front of you. The Rambam said that afal pi shetkiato shofar gzera takatuvu, even though the Torah said you blow the shofar, remez yeshbo, there is nonetheless a hint. And what is it? Uru yishenim mishenatchem. Wake up. He goes, it's a wake-up call. It's this sound, it's this jarring sound that wakes you up from this, I don't know, what do you want to call this? This lethargic existence that you may have had until this particular moment. And that's what the shofar does. The shofar wakes you up. So Rosh Hashanah is just this wake up, and you just can't continue on the path that you are. And therefore, he calls Rosh Hashanah a day of hero tshuva. And again, notice something, which really is what should bother you and bothered him, that Rosh Hashanah is during the Aseret Yimei Tshuva. Do you know what we don't do on Rosh Hashanah? We don't say vidui. There's no Hashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. Right? There's no al chait. It's all of this is missing.
I down in the shul where the Rav found an old matzah from the room, and it had vidui in it, and he added it to the.
Yeah.
He added the page. He said that.
Right. No, I can understand why he did it, but Rav Soloveitchik apparently thought he misunderstood the nature of Rosh Hashanah. So I don't want to pick on the right. We don't pick on the right. No, but what he was doing is looking exactly what it is that we do in Rosh Hashanah, and the truth is the normative approach is not to say vidoy, and that's exactly the point. And by the way, this is really based upon the verses in Nehemiah, where the people start to cry and the people upset. And I will tell you, if you look throughout the history, and it goes into the halacha, goes to different opinions, look at the history of Rosh Hashanah, there's always been a tension. There are those who wanted to fast on Rosh Hashanah. And there are those who say, how can I eat? It's Yom Adin. And others, no. What did the pasuk say? because they know, they said they took out the Torah, started reading, and they see the date that said, and they all start to cry. He says, no, go back and celebrate and share and eat good things and sweet things and so on and so forth. Which means this tension of Rosh Hashanah of being one of the Sertimei Tshuva and nonetheless pushing that aside and saying, no, this is a celebration. Which means ultimately Rosh Hashanah is about a coronation. Ultimately it's about accepting God as the one who's going to judge us. And that itself is somehow redemptive. But maybe the secret of Rosh Hashanah then will depend upon understanding what is here her tshuva. And I'm saying that's exactly part of Rav Soloveitchik's point is going to be, if you don't know what here her tshuva is, then you kind of get stuck. Hold it, what am I doing in Rosh Hashanah? So therefore let's continue a little bit more. So here's a shir that was given in 1976. This particular reconstruction and the words over here, the way that it was written is mine. And here he's talking about Erev and Boker and the structure of tshuva. And he's going to be moving really from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, and he says as follows. Drawing upon the Ramban and the Ben Ezra, based on Bereshit in the very beginning, talking about Vayerev, Vayivoker, right from the beginning, explore the symbolic meaning of Erev and Boker. Now the word Erev, evening, what does the word come from? Evening is a time of confusion. Why? What is it? It's ta'arovet. What is Erev? Erev is really twilight. Erev is a time of confusion between light and darkness, and it's not a time of clarity. When forms blur and distinctions fade, it is the moment when man loses clarity, when moral categories collapse into ambiguity. Boker, morning, is a time of discernment, when light reveals the contours of reality and man regains his capacity to distinguish between good and evil. This division of time is not arbitrary. The Rav taught that the human condition is structured around this dialectic. Man sins in the Erev. No, I'm not saying exclusively, but it's a good time to sin. But he doesn't necessarily only mean the time, that the night is a time of sin or the Erev, in a fog of confusion, in the existential disorientation that accompanies freedom. Again, man is created with free choice. Now that's going to be part of what we're going to have to try to unpack. But it is precisely this confusion that makes tshuva possible. If man were always in a state of clarity, he would be an angel, not a human being. The greatness of man lies in his ability to emerge from Erev into the Boker, to transform confusion into insight and failure into growth. Now hear her tshuva. The Gemara teaches that even a wicked man who betroths a woman on condition that he is righteous may be considered righteous. Shema hira tshuva belibo. Perhaps he contemplated repentance. The Rav saw in this halachic principle a profound psychological truth. The first moment of tshuva is not action but thought, not confession but contemplation. Here tshuva is the moment when a man becomes aware of his brokenness. It's the silent cry of the soul, the shame that precedes speech, the pain that precedes healing. It is the erev of tshuva, the moment of existential crisis that opens the door to transformation. On Yom Kippur, man lives through both Erev and Boker. The night is filled with introspection, with the weight of memory and regret. The day brings clarity, the possibility of renewal. The Rav emphasized that tshuva is not merely a return, it's a creative act. The penitent does not revert to his former self, he becomes a new being. As the Rambam writes, yesterday he was hated by God, today he is beloved. This transformation is what makes Yom Kippur a day of unity between past and future, between sin and sanctity, between man and God. And I'm going to try it again to unpack this, explain a little bit more. A person who's involved in a world of sin has their own way of looking at the world. Yes, this person has free will, but they don't. The reason they don't is because they're not able to contemplate that anything other than what they're doing is desirable. So what's desirable to them is the fog which they live in. That moment that they realize that their existence is actually within a fog, that's here her tshuva. To realize that realization that there is something else. By the way, in another talk, we'll see if we have enough time to come back to this. In another talk, he spoke about the personality of TORAH, who does something incredible, and that is that TORAH begins his trip to the land of Kahn, and he says TORAH is somebody who experienced here her tshuva. Now, whether he completes it or not is something, again, which we would need to come back to. And he actually was very optimistic about TORAH. He goes, TORAH is somebody who is an idolater, and his son embarrasses him by being a monotheist, and at some point he is shaken out of his confidence, and he has this really jarring thought, what if Abraham's right? By the way, that possibility, what if Abraham's right, is here her tshuva. Which means, what if there's this other possibility and my life has been a lie and I'm doing something which is wrong? Which means, hear her tshuva, which, we saw the Bnei Yissaschar. He can't even contemplate this. He's saying, no, it must be it's tshuva ma'ava, which again, in our continuum, was just so far down the line. And now we realize that what the Rav is saying, and again, Rav Kook to a certain extent, it's the spark of tshuva. The Rav, I think, is incredibly precise by saying, it's the moment when you wake up with confusion from the clarity that you thought that you had prior to this. And this confusion is actually clarity, because this confusion at night is going to allow you then to wake up and to complete the process, and then to get to a new level of clarity, which will be to complete the tshuva. So, and now the remarkable thing is that person who has that fleeting thought that, no, the world that I'm involved in is a lie, that person is no longer the same person who was involved in those sins. That person is somebody else already. Yes, to complete the process of tshuva, you need to reject the past. You need to change who you are. Again, I want to focus on that. You need to change your actions. You need to accept upon yourself you would change, and you need to change. But nonetheless, if we think about tshuva in the sefer of Mada, within this thought process, now you realize that here her tshuva is something which is phenomenal, because it's till this point you've misused your free will to create a world of illusion, and now you've used your free will to realize that you haven't been using your free will, and to realize that there's this other possibility where clarity can yet be achieved. But that moment of confusion that night, that moment of confusion by realizing I am in confusion. What I thought was made all the sense in the world, the life that I've lived till now, is not the life that I want. That person is no longer the same sinner. And to the extent that if he says, I'm not Shani Tzaddik, that person at that moment is a Tzaddik, because he's not part of that previous world. He has just taken his first step to the next world. And that perhaps is the most dramatic halacha. And that, by the way, is what should give us incredible hope on Rosh Hashanah. Because on Rosh Hashanah, you hear the blow of the shofar and you wake up and you say, hold it a second. How many lies have I embraced? How many lies do I love? How many lies in my own life have I taken and made it the very core of my being? And how many of those lies now do I realize that are lies? And if I realize that those are lies, now the first step comes that I can start using this free will again, and then to change. Yes, when this takes place on a national level, then we'll be looking about these verses that over here in the Devarim. But again, maybe that's the first step on the national level as well, is that a generation of people realize that, how many people think that the greatest thing in life is that next football game coming up on Sunday? I had to have a meeting with students this coming week and looking for a right time between Israel and West Coast here. I said, if you have it at 1 p.m., people are going to be watching football at the same time. They're not going to really be paying attention because, Tadir v'she'eno Tadir or Kadosh v'eino Mekudosh. So, and so on. People live their lives in illusion. But that moment that you realize that it is in fact an illusion is that moment that you've taken that first step to be able to now find what reality is, and that itself is redemptive, and that itself is what Rosh Hashanah is, and that's the blow of the shofar to wake you up and say, I've been sleeping, and I've been sleeping on this, and there's something else which is there in front of me, and therefore the Rav called Rosh Hashanah the day of hear her tshuva, and that day that turns us into a tzaddik, and we're written in the book of life on Rosh, without anything else. I'm sorry, I just really want to stress that, without having to say al chayr anything. No, at that moment, and I woke up and I said, okay, I have a direction. Yeah, I need the rest of the Zeret to make tshuva, and yes, I'm going to need Yom Kippur. But at that moment, when you had that hear her tshuva, we're all tzaddikim at that moment, and at that moment, we're all written in the book of life. B'ezrat Hashem, all of us, all Klal Yisrael should be written in the book of life, and all of us should wake up and reject the illusions that we have accepted as reality.